What if the Nazis had won World War II? And for more alternate history, be sure to stay tuned. World War II was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, with over 70 million fatalities. The war in our timeline saw the defeat of some of the most evil people ever, including the destruction of Nazi Germany. But what if things had gone differently? In this video, I am going to explore the possibility of a Nazi victory in World War II and what that might have looked like. Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, marking the beginning of World War II in Europe. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany following their obligations to defend Poland. However, their declarations were largely symbolic, as neither country took any immediate action. The invasion itself was a resounding success for Germany, who quickly overwhelmed the Polish defenses and advanced deep into the country. By September 17th, the city of Warsaw fell, and after further advances, Poland was officially no more. On October, the Allies began their own invasion of Poland from the west, but it was too little, too late to save the nation. And both sides agreed to the armistice on October. The quick victory over Poland showed that the German military was indeed a powerful force to be reckoned with. So it was all the more surprising when 2 months later, they were forced into a fighting retreat from the west by the British Expeditionary Force and the Free French forces. But as the Allies pushed deeper into German territory, their supply lines became dangerously stretched thin, making it increasingly difficult to maintain the momentum of their attack. Meanwhile, Hitler decided to shift his focus back to the east, opening up a second front. He hoped this would force the Soviets to divert troops away from the Western Front, potentially allowing the Germans to achieve victory against the Allies. Hitler's gamble paid off. As the Germans advanced deep into Russia, the Soviets were forced to move troops away from the West. And despite fierce resistance, the German armies pushed on, eventually reaching Moscow by October 1941. Here, however, their advance stalled as they faced bitter, cold, and insufficient supplies. But rather than withdraw, Hitler ordered his generals to press on and capture the city. And after a brutal 2-month siege, Moscow finally fell in early December. It appeared as though Germany was destined to win the war, as they now controlled much of Europe and the Soviet Union. But in reality, the Battle of Moscow proved to be a costly mistake. The German army suffered severe casualties, and their inability to take Moscow demonstrated to the world that the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht was actually vulnerable. Still, the Nazis had gained the upper hand, and things could still go their way. So let's explore what a Nazi victory in World War II might have looked like. Let's start by looking at the Soviet Union. After capturing Moscow, the Germans would continue their advance eastward, conquering the rest of European Russia and perhaps even reaching the Ural Mountains. Much of the Soviet leadership would flee to the Pacific island of Sakhalin, which remained relatively untouched by the war, establishing a government in exile. A few isolated pockets of resistance would remain, such as the forces around Stalingrad, but these would be crushed within a year or so. Meanwhile, the Germans would also occupy a significant portion of Siberia to secure their control over Russia. With the rest of the Soviet Union effectively neutralized, Germany would now turn its attention to the Far East, where Japan was making substantial gains. As we discussed in a previous video, Japan was doing quite well during the war. They had already conquered much of Asia, including key allies such as Thailand, and had pushed deep into the Pacific, threatening Australia itself. To counter this threat, the US had begun a massive campaign to liberate the Philippines and drive Japan out of Southeast Asia. But with the collapse of the Soviet Union, America's ability to support this effort would be compromised, forcing them to scale back their intervention. This would allow Japan to stabilize their gains in Asia, while also mounting an invasion of the Indian subcontinent through Burma. Although initially successful, the Japanese advance into India would eventually be stopped by the British, who would then launch a counter-offensive to retake Burma. But this would prove to be a costly and lengthy process that would drag on for several years. Meanwhile, in Europe, the war would take an unexpected turn after the Italian island of Sicily fell to the Allies in April 1943. While the Germans would manage to hold out against the British and Americans in the south, they would be unable to prevent the establishment of a beach. From here, the Allies would begin their long march up the Italian peninsula, meeting fierce resistance all the way. But eventually, in September 1945, Rome would fall and Mussolini's regime would come to an end. Still, the war in Europe was far from over. As the Allies advanced through Italy, the Germans would launch a final desperate counterattack across the rest of the continent. They hoped to recapture key cities such as Paris and London before once again turning their attention to the Italian front. The British and Americans, however, had been expecting this last-ditch effort and were prepared for it, successfully repelling the German attack and pushing them back. The Germans would continue to resist fiercely, but it was clear that their defeat was imminent. On May 2nd, 1946, Berlin fell and Hitler committed suicide. Without their leader, the remaining Nazi forces surrendered unconditionally, ending World War II. So we can see that in this alternate timeline, the war played out fairly similarly to our own until the very end. The main differences being the outcome of the Battle of Moscow and the collapse of the Soviet Union. With the Soviets out of the picture, the Allies would struggle to dislodge the Germans from Western Europe, even resorting to an invasion of southern Italy to get around them. Ultimately, however, the Nazi war machine would grind to a halt without the resources to sustain it. In this new timeline, the war may have ended with an Allied victory, but it would have come at a much greater cost. Millions more would have died as the Allies struggled to dislodge the Germans from Western Europe, and the global balance of power would have shifted dramatically with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Instead of facing off against each other in a nuclear arms race, the United States and their allies would find themselves in a tense standoff with Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The outcome of the war would also have massive implications for the future of Europe. Under the original timeline, post-war Germany would be occupied by the Allies and serve as a bulwark against future aggression from Russia. But with Germany on the winning side, the tables would be turned, and it would be Germany who would become the dominant power in Europe. This would spark a new arms race between Germany and the Allies, who would fear German domination of the continent. Additionally, the status of Eastern Europe would be completely uncertain. In our own timeline, the Soviets would establish a communist regime in most of the region. But with the Soviet Union itself destroyed, there is no guarantee that this would happen. There is a possibility that the entire region would come under German control or be split up amongst the other victorious powers. Furthermore, the fate of the Jewish people would be bleak as the Nazis would likely attempt to carry out their plans for genocide against the Jews, regardless of the outcome of the war. Perhaps the only hope for the Jews would be the intervention of another hostile power such as the Soviet Union. But with the Soviets defeated and likely fractured along ethnic lines, this seems highly unlikely. Finally, the role of the United States would be thrown into complete chaos. In our own timeline, the US emerged from World War II as a global superpower. But with the Nazis victorious, the US would simply be seen as another great power, albeit a powerful one. The end of the war would see the emergence of three superpowers: Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and the United States. Each would vie for global dominance, and the world would enter a new era of tension and conflict. The Cold War would truly have begun. What do you think? How do you think the war would have played out if the Nazis had won? Be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching.